Welcome to the Christ and Classics podcast, where we consider the classics in light of the Christ. My name is Colton Moore, and for today's episode, we have a very special guest whose name is
Ben House.
And he's with us today to discuss a pressing topic at hand, at least here in the States, and that is classical Christian education. Ben has got 40 plus years of education under his belt. He's got a book, Punic Wars and Culture Wars, Christian essays on,
History and Teaching.
History and Teaching. He's also just recently been published in a book called The Devil's Diet. Oh gosh, subtitle has something to do with the 7 deadly sins.
Yes.
And you don't remember it?
I'm just one of several contributors.
Yes, on the chapter regarding lust. He's got several other articles and publications online. You can find him in a variety of places. And as we were just talking, several unpublished things that you'd like to speed up across the finish line at some point. So the goal for the next 25 minutes or so is simply to get to know Ben a little bit. He's taught for 16 or so years in a public setting, and about 25 or so years ago transitioned out of the public education realm and began a new classical Christian school. And since this podcast deals with Christ and the classics, and since the classic works of antiquity and even modern classics are so integral to a classical Christian education, we thought it'd be a good idea to maybe talk about that. And so, Ben, I'd like to just start off. We could start in a few different ways, but why don't you just tell us a bit about your education experience? How did you get started teaching? Where did you teach at first? How long? And then what made you transition out of a government public education toward a private classical Christian education?
Well, I had what I would just consider an ideal experience in public schools. And I didn't leave public schools because of being upset or being angry over things they were doing or over things that were included at that time. I was in a school in rural Arkansas. Almost all of the administrators I worked under were Christian. There were Christians on the faculty, and I generally had just lots of latitude in terms of what I could teach. And so I would have very definitely said, and I think any of my students would that paid attention would remember, that I specifically taught from a Christian point of view. I was a history teacher. And so it's easy enough, and if you're dealing with American and world history, to say, I'm going to include these things that sometimes weren't in the textbook. Things like the Great Awakening, an emphasis on the Reformation, more things about Christian influences along the way. So there were lots of opportunities there, but it was never what I wanted as the ultimate final point, because I still wanted to have a better kind of schooling. And it was only whenever I began hearing about classical Christian education that I had that sense that, this is exactly it. I think it would have been easy enough, and we were just always waiting for the opportunity back in those days to have had a Christian school that would have been good. But I think the classical Christian model provided an even better model for it.
When did you start teaching?
I started in 1979, and I had 1 year in Avery, Texas, and then I went to Genoa, Arkansas in 1980 and stayed there until spring of 1996.
Ah, okay. You mentioned that key movements such as the Great Awakening in the States and the Reformation in Europe weren't listed, or at least emphasized in your textbooks?
Well, they were in the textbooks, but usually, a textbook is a hodgepodge of things. So you may have, over a course of a chapter, 20 or 30 different things, and it's really going to be the teacher who's going to decide what gets included, what gets expanded, what gets emphasized, what gets left out. And so I, as a Christian teacher, I put a high premium on those key Christian leaders in the past, both in terms of religious leaders and political leaders, or a lot of emphasis on things like the Puritan founding of many of the American colonies.
So you started teaching in public schools in 1979. When did you cease teaching in public schools? What year?
We started Veritas Academy in 1996.
Okay, so roughly 17 years you were
Yes.
in the public sphere. So what was, in your mind, during those 17 years, what did you sense what was lacking, not just in the history department where you taught mainly, but across the board educationally? What was lacking at that time in public education?
Well, there's a recurring story that whenever you're reading history about people who are, and it doesn't matter where you land in the past, you come across this same story of people who are read widely in the classics, who were reading the Greek tragedians in Greek. They were reading the Iliad, the Odyssey. Then you get to the founding fathers. They were all classically trained. I didn't have the language in my mind as to what that was. I just knew that that education in the past was producing superior results, and over again it happened where you would read about these people who were well educated, who read things in depth, and it kept occurring to me that what I was good at and what I was training my students to be good at was being able to win Trivial Pursuit. So if the question comes up of who wrote Hamlet, well my students would know that. Who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, who wrote this, who wrote that, who did such and such, and it had never been an emphasis to read those things. And amazingly, even though I was in college studying history, we never read any of the classic historians, Herodotus, Thucydides, all the way up to American historians like Bancroft and others. You didn't read those, and it was almost like it never sunk in that we should actually go to the sources. I talk quite often about who wrote the Federalist Papers, why were the Federalist Papers written, but I had never read the Federalist Papers. I think George Grant uses the phrase that is so apt, where he would describe all the different levels of his education, and he would come back and he would say, "I was robbed." And it's because our education system was robbing us of all this great learning. The one exception was I had lots of literature classes, and the literature classes didn't get away from reading the literary works. Since that time, I did take a literature class where we had to deal with all kinds of things like feminist literary theory, Marxist literary theory, queer literary theory, which is the actual name of it, and other things, as opposed to reading the literary works. But in literature classes, we did read Shakespeare, we did read things, but quite often the system at the college level is you read selections. In high school, at best, you read snippets. You never get to go in depth and read the whole works.
Yeah, why is it important to read an entire work instead of just the key sections of the work?
Well, I think a good example with that would be if someone, or if a textbook were to, a traditional secular textbook were to give us something about the Bible, we would end up having something like the Beatitudes and 1 Corinthians 13. And, of course, I love the Beatitudes. I love 1 Corinthians 13, but that doesn't even come close to giving us a picture of the Bible. It doesn't. It gives a thread of what's going on, and it would be given there in a context that doesn't make any sense. And quite often in these stories, you just get a taste of something. It's like if you go and you have a number of different foods and you're just taking a bite of each one. You may very well decide, like, oh, well, this is really good. But taking a bite of something is not like having a meal. Classic case. Textbooks would give things like the prologue and the characters to Canterbury Tales. And all of that is rich. But if you don't get the entire gamut of all the stories, you don't see what all these people are really like and what the point of it is. It's just a case of here's a dozen or two descriptions of some odd and interesting people on this trip. You're sometimes, obviously we can't read everything, and some things you might just need a portion of, or you may only have time for that. But quite often, it's just not giving the picture.
Yeah, and it's
like a postcard from if I can use another illustration, it's like a postcard from the Grand Canyon.
And this seems to be still a common thing in public school textbooks, at least from a literature perspective. I remember in high school, middle school and high school, we had literature textbooks that had selections of key works: Scarlet Letter, The Crucible, Shakespeare, and even now. Secular and Christian publishers produce these textbooks with just selections, albeit perhaps there's 2/3 of the work there, maybe, but it's not in its entirety. This is a genuine question. Like, why are publishers doing this rather than promoting whole book works?
Because we like the idea that you can produce this thing called a textbook and it has in it what you need to know. And that's the publisher can make money doing that. If the publisher says, well, go out and buy a dozen novels that are produced from 6 or 8 different sources, that publisher is not making any money. So it's this sense that we can package everything up in a box. And we like being able to do that. That's why people will say something like, well, I've studied this, I've studied that. Like, no, you haven't. You've been through a textbook. and even then, most of the time, people have not read those textbooks carefully. Even then, they haven't been exposed to different views of whatever the issue is, or even the complexity of it. And textbooks are good. In the same way that the dictionary is good. It's like they're a good reference. They have their place and they can be useful, but it's not the depth of learning. You've got to go to some sources, and some of it is just the sheer discipline of plodding through something. And sometimes it's going to be a discipline, and sometimes it's going to be even the kind of thing that's going to be arduous and torturous and miserable, and maybe as a student you'll come away as like, I don't really want to do that again. But it's like running a marathon. There's a benefit to it, even if the last third of it or so you're walking and then finally somebody's dragging you across the finish line. That sense of, I've made it through this.
Yeah, I'm thinking of something right now that I don't think I've put together in my mind yet, so my thoughts are probably going to be really jumbled. But this has to do with a larger theme in education. It seems that we're concerned more about, our concern for the major events or details of a book, or major details of education in general, are to the degree that we devalue some of the minor details of a story or those of education. Here's what I mean. The big moments in a book or a poem, like the Iliad, find their meaning only alongside all of the minor, minuscule details the author has given us. So, for example, I'm in my 8th grade class on Friday. We're in book 1, chapter 7, 8, or 9 of Lord of the Rings. So, the Fellowship of the Ring. We've just met Tom Bombadil, and his whole enigmatic presence with his wife is so jolting. The beauty of his character is enhanced by the well-trodden path alongside the Withy Wendell that he's going back and forth on, that Tolkien spends lots of detail describing, or the reeds in the river that are right next to the water lilies that he goes and picks for Goldberry, his wife, and all the details of the forests and the sky and the mood all play into this final moment when you finally meet Tom, and you're like, this is who he is. And so all these minor details that perhaps the textbook might have cut out because they see it as unnecessary to the main point, actually are purposefully serving to bolster that moment. I think we're hyper obsessed with summaries and synthesizing to a degree that we drown out all the other minor details, and we see that in education. Like I had posted on my door a quote that you sent me about wisdom. Like it was like a pithy satirical quote that was like, "You never hear wisdom, the word wisdom ever referred to in education," and you're right. It's just because we see wisdom as really unnecessary to the task of calculus, or wisdom as like unnecessary really to the task of being able to understand grammar and syntax and to write logically.
Well, there's not a standardized test that's out there that tests wisdom, and education is marked by a number of numbers and things of that sort. And so, if your school is scoring high on those numbers, it must be doing something right. And it's and a person and you know, there are plenty of sharp kids out there who are passing those tests and all, and they may have some wisdom. But wisdom by its very nature is not verifiable. You can't test it. You can't mark it in a grade book. And the schools like to, they fall back to wanting to get everything down to some sort of magic number. I'm always impressed, or not impressed, I'm actually shocked by the fact that we have this magical thing of something like, if you make a 70, that is passing. And I always think of the fact that what if you're approaching a subject that you know nothing about, and in terms of what you go through, you reach a point where you can make a 50 on an exam over it. You know, I can't read a Greek New Testament, but if I could get through 25 to 50% of the words in a passage written in Greek, why would that be considered a failing? I would consider that a great accomplishment. But education is obsessed with these things that we call results. And even we've lost the meaning of words there. So we have at the end of education this thing that's called commencement now. We're coming to our commencement services and thinking that means like, oh, good. And it's kind of funny because kids describe it almost like they've survived D-Day and World War II. It's like, oh, we've been through so much together and now we've accomplished all this. Like, no, it's commencement. You're now going to commence going out and applying what you've learned and experienced and so on. It's not an ending, but it's actually prepared you for a beginning.
Yeah.
But I just have to say that overall, in the American system now, particularly in the state school system, it's not just like, oh, well, we need to change this little policy. We need to, I've really had prayer added back in. If we just took this out, if we just didn't let this group influence it and so on. It's like, no, it's the system that is at fault. And the faults are so many that it's not, a legislative act to change this book or that book is not going to do it.
Yeah. Not just changing the sexual ethics that are promoted or adopted is going to fix the root problem, but everything that's led up to those points. And correct me if I'm wrong, Ben, but there's a term that we typically refer to this kind of education. We call it progressive education. This like in a nutshell, how would you describe all that you've been talking about?
Well, the root of progressive education goes back to the progressive movement out of the late 1800s, early 1900s, and very clearly their worldview was that human perfection was possible. But by and large, it's going to be the state that brings this about. The state is going to create this model of what it looks like, and it's going to then impose that. And that's one of the reasons, one of the objections that has emerged over the years against private education in general, is that those kids aren't learning the same thing as our kids. And I like the thought that even in a system of private Christian schools, that the children that might come out of my school might think that Milton's Paradise Lost is the best Christian epic, and the kids that come out of a Catholic classical Christian school will want to meet them and fight in the playground because they say that Dante's Divine Comedy is the best. So, like, wouldn't that be a wonderful thing?
That would be awesome.
That we're debating that, and and that they're not all thinking alike. We don't learn anything from all thinking alike. And part of learning is just that realization of, like, oh my goodness, how little I know. And so if I run into other people who know that same little bit, and we're just patting each other on the back, nothing happens. But if we run into somebody who says, oh no, I think you're totally off on this, and here's a better way, then whether I adopt what they say or not, if it's just that experience of, like, wow, I just don't know. That's some of what we've talked about recently, and talking about of Mice and Men, of just the struggle with how easy it'd be to come up with a really good answer and just say, when George kills Lenny, that's just totally wrong. Well, of course, killing somebody is wrong, but in the context of that book, we just have to grapple with, well, what about this and what about that, and we're just left there saying, was it an act of murder or was it an act of love to protect him from something far worse?
Yeah.
And if you got an easy answer to that, it's like, I think maybe you need to go reread the book one more time.
Yeah. So you're experiencing all these tensions in public education, which are still thriving today. Just further down.
I would say far worse than what I experienced in 1990 something.
Further down the road, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And so you were introduced to classical Christian education, and tell us briefly, like, how you were introduced to classical Christian education, and then explain to us, like, what it is and why it's a superior alternative to education today.
A good friend of mine and I were reading a lot and listening to a lot of the writings, and reading the writings and listening to tapes by R.J. Rushdoony, who is a strong defender of Christian education.
Notice that, listening to tapes.
Yes, cassette tapes. That's what we were listening to, yes. And R.J. Rushdoony was advocating Christian education back in a time when very few people outside of some Dutch communities, Dutch Reformed communities, and some Catholics were advocating such a thing. And we were imbibing what he was saying. And his organization produced a journal called Journal of Christian Reconstruction. And they had a journal devoted to education, and it reprinted an article by Dorothy Sayers on the lost tools of learning. And Dorothy Sayers had been a friend to C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, and had she not been a she would have been one of the Inklings down there with the guys hanging out. She may have broken in there on occasion anyway, but she's in the same mindset. And we read this article, and we're both just struck by this concept of the trivium. And then it was put aside because life went on. And then we discovered that there were people who had read that same article and who said, let's start a school like this. And I don't know exactly when the name Classical Christian Education got pinned onto that, but as it happened, there were some people that we knew of that started a movement and a school thinking that way. And it turned out that, as God so often does, there were other people in other parts of the country who were doing and saying and moving in the same direction. So it was like, well, hey, you're not alone. We're doing that too. And then there were those people who were saying, we've been doing parts of that for ages. And so we got swept up in what was then just a very off the grid kind of movement. And what came about for us was that in our church, we had lots of families that were homeschooling. They had tried various ACE programs, which were self-paced, a really pitiful Christian education program, but it did have the result of kids from ACE schools were testing out a year or two above kids from public school. And they were trying other things. Abeka had put together a curriculum. Bob Jones had put together, and I'm talking about K through 12 curricula. Bob Jones had done the same. There were a few other little publications here and there. And in our church, people were finding the homeschooling or the less than satisfying Christian schools okay for elementary, but their kids were moving into high school. And the parent who feels comfortable teaching their child's 7th grade math doesn't feel as comfortable going into algebra 1, 1 and 2 and geometry and calculus. And whatever else might be missing. So the opportunity was there for us. We had a fairly large number, we thought. I think maybe about 6 or 8, maybe 10 kids of high school level. So we started a school that was grades 7 through 12. And it was with this idea of this is a classical Christian school. And meanwhile, we were asking ourselves for the next 5 or 6 years, we were saying this is a classical Christian school, and also saying what is a classical Christian school,
Yeah.
because we were defining it and trying to figure it out. And we knew that at a classical Christian school you teach Latin, and we knew that you had a course called logic, whatever that is, and we knew that we were supposed to have a class called rhetoric, whatever that is, and very obviously, if it's called a classical Christian school, you ought to read classics. There was a lot of trial and error, and there were a lot of things where it goes back to what G.K. Chesterton said, and he said anything worth doing is worth doing badly. And we did a lot of incredibly great things badly, but it was good because it was venturing out and trying things that had not been done, and with teachers who were in some cases not trained teachers who, and like myself, I was trained in the public school system, and we were having to say, how can we do this in a way that's better? You don't jettison everything you've ever done as a teacher, but you just try to figure, is there a better way?
Yeah. So what was different between trying to teach according to a classical model in this new school as opposed to teaching in a public environment?
Well, one of the big things, of course, is that it was a Christian school, and so that made a difference, and it was self-consciously going to be Christian in all areas. So one of the most amusing stories was someone who called once, and they said, can we enroll our child, but we want to skip chapel in the morning and just skip the Christian part and then go on to class. That's not the way we operate. And so that was one major thing. And another part was that we were not going to be caught up in fads and trends, and we're teaching a test, or we're trying to make sure that we follow all of these little, whatever the latest thing is. We want to, if you're not sure what you're doing in the field of education, you go back and look at what's gone on in the past. You don't say something like, well, we're not sure about grammar. Why don't we just try just,
new.
Let's just try not having grammar.
Or let's have some artificial intelligence generate grammar for us. Maybe
yes.
that'll...
Well, so we went back to, that's why a lot of times schools will go back to things like phonics or teaching more traditional ways of doing things. And it's not a sense there that everything that was done 100 years ago was perfect or that it's always the model. But I can pretty well assure you that if you're caught up in educational trends, whatever the buzzwords are in the public school system right now are things you should avoid. They might accidentally get something right every now and then, but most of the time that's going to be wrong. So, and even to the point of special educational needs, which is a broad area and all, and it has to be addressed in some sense because we learn differently, and not every child can function in a situation where they're having to learn Latin. But part of what kids have to learn is that, oh, I'm not good at remembering things, so I've got to be good at writing things down.
Yep.
And the other child has to learn, it's like, I am good at writing things down, but I've also got to train myself to learn these things because, we're not just teaching kids to be good clerks.
Right.
So, it's teaching, as Dorothy Sayers said, is teaching the child how to learn. And some of that comes from the child learning himself or herself, so that he or she gets to that point where it's like, I don't like to read, but it doesn't matter because I've got to read this book.
Yeah.
And they force their way through it the same way that coaches traditionally do not shorten the court of a basketball court or the football field to make it easier for people. We don't reduce races to just a few feet of walking around the block. But it's like, you got to train, you got to push.
Yep.
And kids can do a lot more than what we think they can do. They're going to groan and complain and all that kind of thing. And sometimes you have to, as a teacher, just realize like, oh yeah, I'm killing my students. But they can accomplish a lot more than what our traditional system, our traditional public system has said they can do.
Yeah, what I really enjoy about Sayers' lecture that she gave, which is subsequently printed now. It's a famous passage. I don't have it pulled up in front of me, but I'll paraphrase, where she likens a classical. Well, I don't even think she uses the phrase classical education so much as just education in general, like recovering the lost tools of learning. Like she compares ideal education, which we would consider classical education, to playing the piano. You can teach anybody row your boat on the piano, how to play it. You don't know how to read music, just teach him what keys to press and teach him the tune, and he can do that. But you then set a piece of music in front of him that has Mary Had a Little Lamb on it. He can't play that because you haven't taught him the tool of reading the music and relating that in your brain to your fingertips. I think in modern progressive education, we're so focused on creating hyper specialists at the expense of general deep thinkers, and as John Piper would say, feelers, those who feel appropriately to the content before them. Feel as in like their emotional response. They have there's an emotional reaction to what it is you're learning, especially in a literature class. So a classical education, the vision that captivated my heart and mind back in like 2016 was this vision of
you're a novice.
I know it. I'm young. I know it. I was going to make a joke about my hair. I am going bald. So, well, I'm not going bald, but my hair is receding. My daughter reminded me this morning. She pulled my head down and got the crown of my head. It's like, Daddy, you got a bald spot. I'm like, don't remind me. I'm just 30. So maybe I'll be wise one day. But this vision,
it's got to turn gray first.
if it doesn't fall out before then.
Yes.
It's like education is all about learning how to learn. Like when you graduate with your high school diploma when you're in the 12th grade, you should and under ideal circumstances, you should feel confident to learn anything that you want to learn. Like my buddy, I graduated seminary with him, and he goes off to Tennessee, and he's about to start this THM program, but he's got to find a job, and he's struggling to find something, and he ends up getting on with a fence building company, and I was like, brother, do you you know how to build fences? You ever built a fence in your life? He said, no. But if anything that Wheaton College and Bethlehem College and Seminary have taught me is that I know how to learn, and I can pick up a book and read how to do it, and I feel confident to do that. And I just thought that's a great place to be at, where I don't know, like right now, my algebra skills are probably nothing. Like I probably need to retake 5th and 6th grade mathematics, quite frankly. But you know what? I feel really confident in picking up a book and going through it, because I feel confident with the tools of learning. And I think that's the goal of a classical education. But also the ultimate goal would be like, maybe you could debate the ultimate goal, which is praise and honor and glory to God, but wisdom and a sound mind to make the appropriate decisions at the appropriate times as a result of your education. And I think public education really is lacking in that regard, as well as the realms of grammar, logic, and rhetoric altogether.
Yeah, what you were saying reminded me that years ago, the high school teachers used to assign the Scarlet Letter. And the reason why they did that is because, the ones I would hear, they would say, oh, well, when you get into freshman English in college, you're going to have to read this. And then they would find out, lo and behold, teachers who are teaching freshmen aren't teaching that book, they're teaching a different one. And it was this kind of sense like, we've got to teach you something so that you've been through it once whenever you get there. And classical education has something different. And that is, it's teaching you how to learn. So if you get there and they are reading Christian Lavransdatter, then it's like, it doesn't matter if you can't even make it through the name of it. It's like, you know how to read and you know how to learn.
Yep.
And that's the same way with taking on any class. And it goes back to the way that classical education is built, and that is, you've got to learn the grammar of a subject, which unfortunately is what we sometimes equate as knowing the subject. But you've got to learn that, and then you've got to know the logic of it, and that is how it functions together. And then you are all striving toward that rhetoric stage where you can compose ideas, work problems, present papers, debate it, whatever, by taking different sides and seeing it in its depth. Now, and granted, we're not going to reach a real rhetoric stage in most areas in our lives, but we have to realize that's what learning is all about. You learn the names of the books of the Bible. You learn particular Bible verses and things of that sort, and then you start relating those things, and then you start seeing the big picture as a whole. And that's just the essence of education. And all Dorothy Sayers was doing is just reflecting on how people learn. And you're going to, that's why in even the worst of education, you're going to get bits and pieces that fit into a classical approach to education, because you cannot escape that, even in the worst scenarios.
Yeah, that's good. Ben, with the last few minutes, I just want to ask one question. There's a big classical movement in America right now, and it's happening on at least a couple of fronts. One is obviously in the classical Christian front, with evangelical Christians, Catholic Christians, even Eastern Orthodox Christians rising up schools all over the private classical Christian schools all over the nation. But another one is government-sanctioned classical charter schools, which, in my opinion, I think are doing a lot of great good for the common education all across the nation. Now, there's a distinction between classical education and classical Christian education. And what's the distinction between the two, and why would we say that classical Christian education is superior?
Oh, that's a lot to have to answer there. I think because you've got to get down to ultimately the questions like, what makes anything important? And obviously, if you get a better variety of something and a classical approach to education, if you're teaching a child better books, if you have better teachers, if you have a better approach, you're going to produce a more educated student. But in the Christian worldview, we are not just teaching so that we have model citizens and maybe some future presidents and senators and thinkers and all that. We're teaching for eternity. And if eternity is real, and that is the foundation of Christian thought, then that should pervade education. If what Van Til says, that all facts are God-created and God-interpreted facts, then that changes the approach to all facts. So it's vital in the sense that Christianity is vital. Even though I would be glad to see that people who are given secular educations are well trained in things, because I think that provides a good leeway to evangelism and discussion.
Yeah, that's great. And so if you've never heard of classical Christian education before, or if you're interested in classical Christian education, there's a number of places that you can go to online, and we will provide the links in the description below. But one big place that you can go is the Association of Classical Christian Schools.
Yes.
That's probably the biggest organization that unites the majority of classical Christian schools in the nation. There are other fantastic organizations like CiRCE. There's Classical Academic Press. There's Memoria Press, Veritas Press, and the number is growing. We'll link several of these in the description below. But as always, Ben, it's great having you on. This has been a wonderful discussion, and I wish we could keep it rolling. I mean,
the day will come.
Well, tomorrow when we go to work, it'll keep continuing. So, okay. Till next time.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.